Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggles. I'm your host, Richard Berg. Today we're going to talk about climate justice crisis. But before we do, I'm hoping our listeners will indulge me while I go on just a little bit of a rant here. On Monday morning, July 29th, the FBI conducted raids at multiple locations in St. Louis and St. Petersburg, Florida, targeting the Uhuru movement. They employed flashbang grenades, handcuffing Amali Yeshitela and his wife. The reasons the raids targeted the Uhuru movement is because of their opposition to the United States foreign policy. The Department of Justice is alleging that they collaborated with a Russian asset to spread propaganda. We know that the U.S. is engaged in a proxy war with Russia. And we know that they're targeting here progressive people who disagree with U.S. foreign policy, and this is crazy. If you stand up and challenge a policy, you're subject to this kind of harassment. We're going to post in our show notes a statement by the Committee to Stop FBI Repression and the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression that Fight Back News is circulating. Our guest today, who will talk about organizing in the midst of the climate crisis, also has some experience with repression. Tracy Molm will talk about how her involvement in the Anti-War Committee got her and others involved in forming the Minnesota Climate Justice Committee. But like the Uhuru movement activists, she was the target of FBI and the U.S. Attorney for her activism in the Anti-War Committee. On September 24th, 2010, her home, along with 6 others, were raided by the FBI. She was one of 23 activists that was subpoenaed by the grand jury. Tracy was repeatedly threatened with jail for her refusal to testify in front of the grand jury. The government targeted veteran Chicano activist Carlos Montes and veteran Palestinian activist Rasmia Oda. A national defense campaign with wide support defeated most of the attacks. Our interview with Tracy happened before the attacks on the Uhuru movement, so it's not discussed in the interview that you're going to hear here today. I want listeners of Fight Back Radio, however, to show solidarity and support for the Uhuru movement and any progressive activists attacked by the government for their views on foreign policy. Finally, don't talk to the FBI yourself. If they come to your door, whatever, don't talk to them. Just say you have nothing to say. Tell them if they're persistent that they can talk to your attorney. If you need more information on how to handle this, I would direct you to the National Lawyers Guild, who is very good at this and can tell you what to do. So that's the end of my rant a little bit here. I think it's important for progressives in times like this to stick together and to understand that the threat that's actually out there, even from our own government. My guest today, as I said, is a very determined activist. Tracy Molm has dedicated her life to the fight for justice, be it issues of war and peace, or justice in the community, or what you're going to hear about primarily today, climate crisis. Since we sat down with Tracy, though, I want to also point out around the climate justice issue, there's been a significant Supreme Court decision. In the case of West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to significantly narrow the scope of the Clean Air Act. This is a major punch in the face to any efforts to rein in greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning power plants. This could set a precedent also that could turn back labor and civil rights laws even further if that's possible. So it's appropriate that we have a kick-ass fighter for climate justice on today. You'll hear Tracy talk about strategy, the need to move regular people into action, to get people into the streets and to get them as angry as they actually should be. You'll hear her respectfully criticize the strategies that are not working from other forces. And finally, I think Tracy, she's a Marxist Lenist, and she says that, and she talks about how that fits into her views on the fight for climate justice, and I think you'll find that interesting as well. So I think you'll enjoy the interview. So here's Tracy Molm. Hello, Tracy. Welcome to Fight Back Radio.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit to start out with about the battle around Line 3. And I was hoping, there's this, people are vaguely aware that there's global warming out there. It's been everywhere. And so what was the battle around Line 3? How does that help us with the global warming issue?
So Line 3 is an oil pipeline built from Canada through Minnesota to bring tar sands oil to Canada for a Canadian company called Enbridge. They built this oil pipeline at a time when we know that the globe is warming and that fossil fuels play a huge role in that. So there's no need for more infrastructure around fossil fuels, and yet they continue to build this pipeline despite tons and tons of opposition, despite movements and people fighting against it, including many of the native peoples that people who live in the area who were fighting for the resources, the water in particular, that the pipeline would be putting in jeopardy. There have been major pipeline spills, including in Brainerd, Minnesota up north. There was a huge pipeline spill back in the 80s that destroyed the water in the area. And so people were justifiably angry and wanted to fight against it.
So, people came together, people from across the Midwest, across the world coming together, and Native people, I think especially, were playing a leadership role and a primary role in this. Could you talk a little bit about the movement and the resistance to Line 3?
Yeah. So one of the main, biggest ways to stop an oil pipeline is to stop construction. And so people in the area where it was being built up north, led by the indigenous people whose land it was on, they were putting their bodies on the line to stop construction. There were over 800 people total arrested to stop construction on Line 3. Some of the worst police violence happening in Minnesota, actually, at the time. Some of it was at Line 3, where they were attacking people, arresting people for no reason, pulling people out of native ceremonies in the water, and arresting them. The police up north were actually given money directly from Enbridge to continue to fight protesters and to jail them. It was really appalling.
So, and I know in the last presidential elections between Biden and Trump, Trump was like, there is no global warming, and whatever, those people are just troublemakers, and we should have as much oil as we can get, and et cetera. And so there was some hope amongst sections of the environmental movement that Joe Biden would be a savior for the environmental movement. Can you talk a little bit about Biden's environmental record since he's become president of the United States?
Yeah, it's the bar is low when the people get excited that he acknowledges that there's global warming happening, and Biden promised to end the oil pipelines. He agreed that it wasn't oil infrastructure isn't where it's at, and it isn't going to help our planet or people. And when he came into office, he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, leaving the Dakota Access pipeline, leaving Line 3 to spite, even senators or representatives like Ilhan Omar writing letters saying, what are you doing? Like, they are the same. And his justification for canceling the Keystone XL was that we don't need more fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to move on. Acting like one oil pipeline is the one thing about that, when there's all these other oil pipelines being built. They're talking about Line 5, which would go through Minnesota and Michigan. Again, at a time when global warming is so clear and so devastating for the world, but here we are fighting to stop infrastructure that just continues and perpetuates the use of fossil fuel in the world. So,
despite this heroic effort against Line 3, they did construct it, and but your organization, the Climate Justice Committee, has not given up on this. And could you talk a little bit about your efforts to continue, even though it's constructed already, to stop Line 3?
Yeah, and we believe in the Climate Justice Committee just because the oil is flowing through Line 3. There's no reason that it can't get shut off. The same way it was turned on, you can turn it off. And one of the key ways to do that, or the way that we're fighting right now, is targeting the Army Corps of Engineers. They have the ability, and actually it's their duty, to look at infrastructure, and especially oil pipelines. And so they should have done an environmental impact survey, which would look at both the environment, but also populations, like the indigenous populations that it would affect and the resources around there. And they never did that survey. Enbridge was basically given a pass, which is appalling. Like, the whole point of the Army Corps is that they should be looking at how infrastructure will affect the world and not just give away the resources and all of this land to private corporations to do whatever they want.
So, how are you trying to get them to stop? Are you sent them a letter, or what's the deal?
So we're working on a campaign where we have a petition going right now. It's up on our website and through our social media, Climate Justice MN, and we will be kind of building up petitions. We've got over 500 at this point. We're just getting started. I think that we can really ramp that up. And we're going to present those to the Army Corps of Engineers and really work to put pressure on them. They operate kind of in the shadows. Like, nobody knows that they're behind things like oil pipeline infrastructure, giving the permits for mining also. And so to highlight and really put a spotlight on their role and the role that they can play to actually put this country in a better place, as opposed to just green lighting construction for private corporations, is where we're focused.
Okay, and we'll put that in the show notes, how people can get the petition or can contact you as well. Climate justice, as I said, this is something people are aware of. The weather is changing. Can you talk a little more about basically, on a general level, the question of global warming, and what is it going to take? What kinds of things, our listeners across the country, if they set up a climate justice committee, they may not have Line 3 going through their state. What kinds of things should they be looking for to try to save our planet?
Yeah. So I grew up in the 80s, which is going to date me a little bit, but 80s and 90s, and there was this huge campaign to tell us, if we just do a little bit better for the environment, clean up after ourselves, eat less meat, use less plastic, and that's even told now that will help change the direction we're going. And we reject that. We think that it's not about your decisions, your personal decisions aren't actually going to make that big of a difference, because climate change is happening on a global level because corporations and the U.S. government, the U.S. military, are actually some of the biggest polluters out there. The role that you and I, even if every person in this world stopped driving a car, it would be like 17% of emissions. What needs to happen is a fight that is focusing on the role of the U.S. military, the role of giant corporations like Enbridge, to stop them from destroying our planet and taking all the resources for their own profit.
Well, let's talk about the military for a second. So what do they do that's so bad?
Well, there's like 7 different layers of how the U.S. military is like terrible for the environment. You look at the role of Army bases around the globe, from the vehicles that they're using, the planes that they're flying. These are some of the least efficient and most emissions generating vehicles. Humvees, that's not exactly the green vehicle of the future. And then you see they burn their garbage. Like, they have these huge burn pits that just emit tons of emissions into the areas that they're located. Then you think about the role of testing of military equipment, of weapons. Terrible for the environment. Any place that there's a war, you look at the way that the soil has been affected, it's destroyed. Like, the U.S. military, just as an institution, I think is the number 1 polluter in the world because of the number of vehicles that they have. The fuel that they use is for their planes and all that is very dirty. And then the role that they play in creating weapons materials is terrible for the environment.
So it sounds like there's a basis for a unity between those in the peace movement, the anti-war movement, and those in the environmental justice movement.
The Climate Justice Committee actually started, we're pretty new, a year and a half old, out of the anti-war committee, seeing that there was really a place to really talk about that role. The problem is that it's very hard to build movements because it's such a big target. And we found that as an organization, like as a grouping, it was really easy to find more local targets that we could connect with. I think like these are really big issues. And so finding local targets has been really important. But one of the things that sets us apart from all of the other groups in the Twin Cities in particular is that we really work hard to make these connections. So our members in the Climate Justice Committee were at anti-war rallies talking about the role of war in destroying our environment, talking about the role of police brutality and like the connections. The same communities that are over-policed are communities that have the worst asthma rates because they've also been polluted by industry. North Minneapolis in Minnesota has some of the worst asthma rates. One of our other main campaigns is looking at the East Phillips community, which has terrible health outcomes because of historic pollution. You look at the way that they zone different parts and then who moves into those neighborhoods and is encouraged to move up into those neighborhoods. It's no wonder that Little Earth, one of the largest urban reservations, is located in this neighborhood that's got huge industrial history. And so as industry moves out, the goal is to bring in community and to bring in actual things that are good for the people of the neighborhood. So that's, fresh produce and things like that. And so the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute is trying to buy up a location called the Roof Depot. And now they want to build an urban farm. So we're calling it the East Phillips Urban Farm. And we've been working with them, talking about the role of community and local organizing and sovereignty over resources, because these connections are so important, right? Like the environmental movement, it's about people's ability to control their land and resources. And so the East Phillips neighborhood, they want to build an urban farm in that neighborhood, and they're fighting the city that's trying to put all of the industrial waterworks in that same spot.
They want to put it in the exact same location. Is that the problem?
Yeah, it's a 7-acre plot that used to be the Roof Depot. And so
what's the Roof Depot?
The Roof Depot was an industrial site where they built I think they built roofing material. Oh. And so they've got a huge level of arsenic actually. And the arsenic has been contained underground. If the city does what they want to do, which is destroy the building, all of that arsenic gets kicked up. And so that
if it's a garden, wouldn't that cause problems too with the arsenic?
The goal is to renovate the building and actually create aquaponics.
What's that?
So it's like water-based farming, actually. It's a kind of a new level of urban farming in a way that you don't have to have soil. You can build it into the water. This is like way beyond my scientific knowledge. But the idea is like people in that neighborhood can tell you when they got the letter from the city 20 years ago saying you can no longer grow produce on your land because it's all polluted. Like that is the level that East Phillips is looking at. The city councilor, Jason Chavez, who just he just got into office this year, he talks about how that impacted his family because they grew food in their backyard. And the letter came in English, and they are all, primarily Spanish speaking. And so they never got that letter. And then they find out that, his family members are getting cancer and things like that, caused by the fact that the city allowed this industry in a residential neighborhood.
So, and this is an example of environmental racism, right? I mean, this is. Could you talk a little bit about environmental racism? In the particular, like you just did, but this is an issue throughout the country, isn't it?
The globe. I mean, it's not rich white neighborhoods that end up with industrial buildings and heavy industry in their neighborhoods, and that's historic from zoning. The East Phillips neighborhood was a yellow zone, which means that it was actually zoned to be heavy industry, knowing that there are people living there. If you look at whiter neighborhoods in Minneapolis, like further south or South Minneapolis, some parts of South, especially near the water, those were zoned just residential and industry was never allowed in there. Those policies continue to this day, and why, the Climate Justice Committee thinks it's really important to be fighting with the East Phillips neighborhood and to build a movement around it so that we can help empower people and build community where there is, where the city's fighting it.
So how did you hook up with them? How did this start out? How did it happen?
So I was a member of the Anti-War Committee, and the Anti-War Committee's focus is on fighting U.S. imperialism around the globe. And that includes U.S. bases, but one of the pieces that is often not talked about is the role of the climate. All of the metrics now show that the brunt of climate change is being felt around the globe, which is another kind of way that environmental racism shows itself. Like in the United States, we don't see it nearly the same extent that India does, for example, or Southeast Asia overall. And so
what do they see over there in India or Southeast Asia that we don't have here in the United States?
Climate change and like heat waves in a way that is like unreal. So 120 degrees was like a regular temperature in India for several months, like just like temperatures that are unlivable. Desertification happening in Africa, things like that are, and the latest reports are showing that is, when climate change happens, 1% raise in the temperature here is felt like it's a little hotter, but in Africa, it means that more land that could have been gardens or whatever is desert. And so, like, the deserts are growing. People are being pushed out of their land. In Cuba, they're seeing it where the water level is going up. And so we're trying to make those connections. Like, it's harder to organize people when we don't see it as directly. And also when people think of it as a personal choice issue. We actually want to build movements around it and fight and make those connections so that we can connect with people around the globe, but also see it as a local issue.
That's interesting, yes. So well, let me go back to the local then. So East Phillips neighborhood here in Minneapolis, how did you find out that they were having these issues? Did you reach out to them? How did you guys hook up?
They've actually been in this fight for 6 years now, and it's been primarily that they've been working on a legislative level, trying to go to the city council. When we started up, we were focused on Line 3 stuff and talking about the role of the U.S. military, but we couldn't ignore the fact that they were literally in the like kind of final battle with the city council last year in October. They were coming against the question of whether or not they would be granted rights to the land, to the site that we're talking about, this urban or the former Roof Depot site. Once you get connected, and it's easy to see what other things are happening, and it was a clear issue where our membership and we all wanted to get involved and do what we can to organize. The climate movement overall is really focused on policy level changes, and you look at the nonprofits are really, really good at organizing and lobbying legislators. As good in that they do it a lot, not in that they've gotten us the things that we need. And so we see our role as building movements. And so we work with groups like the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute, and we try to have the protest that supports their fight against the mayor in Minneapolis. And so next week we'll go to his office and make a stink to try to help the pressure that they're putting on in both a legal battle and at the city council level.
So this is maybe somewhat you alluded to earlier. Besides the military, we're fighting, a corporate power which has its weight in government as well. Yeah. And so this is a way to try to actually create consciousness and protest and use people power to fight the corporations.
Exactly. It's always been kind of touted as either a personal choice issue or something where you have to go to the policy level. And I think we're at a point in this country where if we don't hit the streets and start building movements, we aren't going to get where we want to be. There's been many years that the Sierra Club, and my goal isn't to bash them, I'm just saying that the way that they organize and try to fight on a legislative level hasn't gotten us anywhere. We need to be in the streets and be angry because what's happening is devastating. Like the crops in this country even you can see it in crop levels. I'm thinking about that because Minnesota, we're 2 weeks behind. People are planting this week, 2 weeks behind the normal schedule for planting. And we can't sustain ourselves.
What does that mean, that they're 2 weeks behind in planting?
That means that crops aren't being grown at the same way or able to be grown in the same way anymore. And so if we continue in this path where the environment is such that we can't grow our own foods, like things like that are going to be devastating. And so our way of life in general is going to have to change. And it's not for lack of people caring. I think it's for lack of people being organized. So
let me go back to that a little bit. So you said people's lives are going to have to change. And, so now you've looked into, you went from an anti-war activist to an environmental activist, or both probably. And so how is our lives going to change? I mean, is this doom and gloom? The planet's going to end in a few years, or
I don't think it has to. I think we can fight, and we can demand more. In the same way that workers can no longer live on $10 an hour. People need to stand up for their rights. They need to organize, and the same for the environment. If we, hope that it'll get better, and that if we elect people into the right positions, it's going to be okay. That has gotten us nowhere. We're at a point where if we don't start organizing, we're going to continue to see places like the erosion of different parts of the country. Like they're starting to say that Duluth is the climate mecca because everybody in California either has wildfires or is losing land to the water, right? Like the water levels are changing. And so if people have to move to Duluth, that's pretty scary. If your other option is to fight, I mean, Duluth is actually a lovely place. I do highly recommend it. But we can do better. We can do better than accept what has been forced on us by the powers that be, by the people making money off of our world. And we can do better by fighting for it.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, some people have been demanding like a Green New Deal.
Yeah.
What do you think of that? Is that a strategy that makes sense?
It's so sad. Like a Green New Deal is way better than what we got right now. But the reality is the Green New Deal includes a lot of stuff that isn't even very possible. We can't all get green cars. People in apartments can't find places to power their cars and things like that. There's a lot of pieces to it that could be good, and there are a lot of pieces of it that are giveaways to corporations. Are giveaways to corporations to pretend like they're going to do better for us. And the problem isn't that corporations don't put green on their signs on Earth Day enough. The problem is that corporations in this, have been really good at stealing resources and using them to make more money as opposed to looking at the world around us. So Enbridge, just like all these other companies on Earth, they act like they're green. The problem is that Enbridge needs to be stopped from building more oil pipelines. We need to actually do something to change our use of fuel, and not like even on an individual level, but on an institutional level. Like the number one user of fuel is the U.S. military. And so if we can change some of that, that's how we're going to actually do better.
So like having electric military vehicles, things like that, or?
No, I think that is a question. Like, what if the military turned to green? The problem is you aren't going to change bombs green. Like, they're still going to bomb and destroy the environment around us, and in the testing of those bombs. All of that is incredibly dangerous to the world. I mean, in the way that the military operates, everything is throwaway. And so you look at military bases and their garbage as things that they should be figuring out how to reuse, really, or shut down. This is the actual answer. Like, they need to be stopped. If we weren't putting bases around the world, that land would actually be usable for the people of those places that these bases are located.
So let me go back to then the things you talked about, building a movement. And I mean, you mentioned the policy people, the not-for-profit, different organizations, Sierra Club, whoever, who are doing some good things in your words. But there's a missing piece to it. They're not successful because there's not the pressure. So looking at, so there's something strategically missing. Where do we put the pressure? How do we do this? What's your answer to that?
I think we need to build movements in a way where we actually look at how do we motivate people to get into the streets? How do we motivate and train people to be organizers, to feel empowered to actually fight for change as opposed to hope for change and hope that if they vote that that person will actually follow through on what they say they're going to do.
I mean, here in this city, in Minneapolis, there was, a year ago, there was George Floyd was killed, and it sparked a movement that for police accountability across the country. And I mean, are you looking for something like that? Is that what we need in the environmental movement?
We are definitely at the point where people should be angry enough, right? Like the fact that the resource used by companies in this country is at a level that no individual's changes would ever affect. There's a reality that we can't, you and I personally, choosing not to eat meat isn't where we're going to make change. We need to make change on a much bigger level, and some of that is by stopping corporations from using the land to whatever degree they want. So that's, factory farming, that's the way that factories deal with animals and things like that. But it's also, taking back and having actual control of our own resources in this country as opposed to selling them all to the highest bidder. And so we should be angry. This isn't a place we have to be in. 50 years ago, the oil industry knew what they were doing. And this year, they put them in front of a Senate hearing and they all acted dumb. Literally Texaco executives are like, well, we had no idea. No, they knew back in the 50s that what they were doing was poisoning the world.
I mean, it seems to me the poor working class people of color who are suffering the bulk of this, the environmental racism that you've talked about in the East Phillips and Little Earth. People like that need to see a program that'll work, and I think you have one there with the East Phillips neighborhood. But it's just saying I think part of the problem, and tell me if you agree or not, but with the environmental movement is it's too big of an issue. It's like global warming. Oh my God! Even if I believe it, and it's what can I do? It's like maybe I can recycle a little bit, and maybe that helps a little bit. But you're calling for something much different. You're saying let's challenge corporate policy, not just by giving a few dollars to a lobbyist, but by filling the streets with angry people that are demanding certain things.
Yeah, that is one of the things that's so beautiful about the East Phillips project. This urban farm is actually it's a positive change. It's like, how can we change and flip this heavy industry location and turn it into something that's actually good for the people? It would be revolutionary in many ways. It provides actually a space where there can be community built where there was pollution. And so the fact that the city is fighting and saying, no, we want to continue to put our pollution is just appalling. Like Minneapolis could be a model for how to actually empower communities to have control and to stop a cycle of pollution and abuse that is to the environment that is just it's like insane. Like, here is your two options for this Roof Depot site. It is to empower the community to have community space, to actually have fresh produce. People in the neighborhood can learn how to do urban farming in a way that's revolutionary using aquaponics because they can't use the soil. But the city is saying, nope, we want to continue to put our heavy industry there in a residential area. And it's, nope, it's just a coincidence that it happens to be this incredibly diverse, primarily oppressed nationality neighborhood. Like, what a surprise. No, it's actually planned. Where the waterworks is currently located is on the edge of town where there isn't a residential area. Why can't it stay there? Why can't they actually fix up the buildings? And as, we've gotten involved in this campaign, it's like, well, all of the evidence is there that would be the most cost effective. It actually makes the most sense that they stay where they are. Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, there's no business he hasn't liked. So, that guy's got somebody who's lining his pockets. He's the primary reason that the East Phillips urban farm isn't moving forward and can't get traction. When they have a ton of resources, they have neighborhood groups and community organizations that are pledging huge amounts of money. They've got like $6 million pledged from a couple different groups. And Jacob Frey says, no, we want you to pay us back for our poor choice in buying this location. Instead of saying yes to helping this neighborhood, we're saying that we're going to make you pay to not be polluted. The north side of Minneapolis used to be the home, like inside of an urban neighborhood was the home of industrial recycling, which was burning of trash, and it continues. Like, that's all around the country. Minneapolis is a microcosm of around the world, or around the country in particular.
One of the other things you mentioned, the Little Earth, Native American people that live there, and this has been, the Native people have been hit hard. It was in Line 3, the Keystone XL, and even going back, to historically, the Trail of Tears, sending them to Oklahoma and then kicking them out of Oklahoma because there was oil there. And so this whole thing of energy and Native American people and how this is effective, could you speak to that a little bit?
I think the continuous cycle of when it's convenient, we're going to push you to some place that's far away, and then when we find out that you have stuff that we want, is a little too familiar in the United States. It's like that's what the U.S. was built on, by theft of land. And so one of the most important parts, I think, of fighting around Line 3 is talking about the role of land and of people having sovereignty over their own land. And so we try to center that when we're talking about the fight to shut down Line 3. We think it's really important that we talk about resources and sovereignty and the rights that people should have over their own resources.
Can you talk a little bit about Little Earth and how that plays out in the East Phillips neighborhood? And for people that aren't familiar with the Twin Cities, how this looks geographically or otherwise?
Yeah, so East Phillips is sitting right outside of downtown Minneapolis. And Little Earth is a kind of like a 3 or 4 block area that is a concentration of Native organizations and housing. It's it's a very poor neighborhood, and it's one that has consistently been kind of left out of urban planning. They're just outside of kind of development zones that they've supposedly been building. There's been a huge upsurge in tent cities in Minneapolis, and a lot of it is, one of the largest ones was right outside of Little Earth, and a lot of Native.
That's where the American Indian movement was born, isn't it?
Oh yes, that's a very important part of Minneapolis history, and something that we're very proud of. It was
the radical Native American movement from the 70s. The urban Native American fight back at that time, which, yes.
Clyde and Vernon Bellecourt, they were incredibly powerful speakers, and a big part of why I got involved actually in the anti-war committee. Every protest I went to, Vernon would be a speaker. He would never be the keynote because he wasn't. We're talking about the war in Iraq. The Iraqi speaker was the keynote speaker. He would speak for the longest and always be the favorite speaker because he was incredible. He had a way of being able to talk about the struggle for Native sovereignty, and in particular, Vernon was focused on sports teams' names. That was one of their a big campaign that they had, and he would connect that to the war in Iraq in a way that was just every light went off. You're thinking, oh, this is incredible. Vernon had a way of seeing how these struggles are very connected.
here you are, one of the leaders of a new environmental group that's starting to kick up some dust here in the Twin Cities. But what led you to that? Tell me a little bit about your story.
My backstory. The short answer is 9/11 happened, and it was like, why are people flying planes into buildings? Well, it's because the U.S. has been one of the largest perpetrators of violence around the globe. People don't just randomly take over a plane and fly it into a building. They do it because they're brought to that brink. And the anti-war committee was like one of the only groups in the Twin Cities that was tackling that issue and really fighting the war drums that were coming after that. Like, people died, so then the solution is to go after another country. It was so appalling and painful, to see, and that really motivated me to get active.
So then the anti-war stuff, you started to see the connections with the environment, and that's interesting. It's that connection to how they're both similar in the same struggle. Let me also ask you. I mean, Fight Back Radio has it won't be a secret to our listeners that we have a strong socialist bend here, but I know you're a Marxist Leninist, and so generally speaking, the socialists and communists and Marxist Leninists have not been at the heart of the environmental movement, and I think that's fair to say. And the fact that you're coming in with different eyes, how do you see that? How do you why weren't we there sooner?
It's, if you read Marx, he does talk a little bit about the role of the environment and the way that capitalists see the environment as another way for profit. But it's a minor point, and I think that's because, at the time of writing, it wasn't the same issue as it is now. Science wasn't where it is now, like understanding global trends, understanding the weather, all of that. These things are cumulative. And that's definitely true of emissions. They're cumulative. And so the effects that we're seeing today are at a level that people probably could never understand even what was going on. Cars weren't everywhere and all of that. Planes weren't, it wasn't like a normal thing for people to get on a plane. So these things were all developed over time. And so you think about where China was at when their revolution happened. Their goal was to build up industry. We're in an advanced industrial society. We aren't in that same place, and so we can build for revolution and build for change that is sustainable in a way that would have never been thought of before. But I also think there are some really, really good models happening right now. If you look at China, for example, like their public transportation is green. Like, it exists, and it's being built in China, or it's being built in Cuba, whose whole focus, like they have a whole program developed around an environmental plan that has people at the center of it, which is, I think, the thing that socialism has to offer that capitalism never can. People are the center. And so if you think about, where are working class people, where are oppressed nationality people, and what is important to them, and then you build out. The environment and the world that we live in is pretty important to us. And so how do we build and grow and do better than capitalism can do for us? That's pretty easy because it ain't doing shit.
So, industrialization caused a lot of our problems with global warming and pollution and just, whatever, even just it's not good for breathing and other things as well. A lot of the global South and the so-called third world, where the poverty is just expansive, and large sections of our planet live in backbreaking poverty. And if you say to them, well, industrialization was bad, you shouldn't industrialize, we should have more poverty, that clearly isn't the answer either. Right. And so, as a socialist, how would you address that? Yeah,
this is a huge question in the environmental movement, because the U.S. is so quick to go and criticize. India is actually a really good example. That's where a lot of the debate is happening now. India's goal right now is to bring water and power to everyone in their country. It's actually a goal in China too. But it's not like they have every option under the sun, because they don't have the same financial resources or even industrial resources that the United States does. They have a right to industrialize however they need to. It is the U.S. as the place that has done historically some of the most pollution in the world has no right to tell them what to do. And that's, I think that as a socialist, it's really important to be clear that we support people making choices that they need to make, and should be working hard to share and to work together to build so that people can make more sustainable choices, but they have to make what choices are going to be good for them. And so we can't deny other countries their right to develop because we fucked it up. Like that, that's the short answer, probably not the answer that could be played on the radio, but the U.S. did it wrong, and the U.S. did it in a way where, capitalist class is going to make the most money. The demand actually in the climate justice movement is to really share and give as much of the resources to do so sustainably. Like that is the demand that I think we unite with in the Climate Justice Committee and in Freedom Road, is trying to build sustainably and do it in the right way. But places like India and Africa, where resources were absolutely stolen and expropriated so that people could make the most money, and now we're going to tell them how they can build their country. Like that's actually not sustainable, and we need to fight for better, and we need to support the demands of people trying to build up their industrialization to be able to have water and have all the things that help make it livable.
Let's go into that a little more. So we're saying that there should be self-determination and democracy in the third world, or everywhere in the world. But can you have that without destroying our atmosphere and putting the whole planet at risk?
I think that there are some really good models for it. Cuba and China are the ones that come to mind, the ones who have really thought out and planned programs around it. And China is really showing the way to share that knowledge and that understanding. So some of the work that they've been doing is bringing public transportation around the globe and showing that they know how to build this infrastructure and bringing it to other countries. And it's really a model for how it should be done. But the other reality is, the U.S. has benefited by the theft of resources around the globe. And Europe has benefited from the theft of resources around the globe. What they should be doing is giving away all of the knowledge that they have to be able to build whatever people need around where the capitalist class is stolen resources.
So let me circle back to you were polite but critical of our friends in the not-for-profit world who have been fighting for policy changes and trying to make electoral changes, and you said that's without a movement that they haven't been successful. But when I look the anarchists as a tendency have been active and have been doing street issues. And how would you assess the anarchist involvement in the environmental movement?
I think that they have done amazing things. The problem is that they are not they're not sustained, right? There's what they did around Line 3 and fighting the construction of Line 3 was incredible. They really mucked it up for Enbridge, and that was awesome. But the problem is that they aren't doing consistent organizing. Overall, the anarchist movement isn't great at building movements that are long and sustained. The phrase I've heard is flash in the pan. That's what comes to mind. And it's not critical. It's a difference in how you view organizing and how you build movements. And some of that comes by studying the mass line. Right?
So what is the mass line?
Believing that, you have to really work with people where they're at and listen to where people are at but also help them to build more and build further. And so we are working hard to see where there are struggles and to connect those struggles from the general to the particular. So you talk about like the East Phillips Urban Farm is about community control of their neighborhood and of their resources. How does that connect to what's happening around the globe? And so looking at that microcosm and going bigger and making sure that we're connecting it to the bigger issue of capitalism and like Climate Justice Committee, we really think that the biggest threat to the environment is capitalism, right? Is putting a price tag on all of our resources. And often that price tag is way too cheap. You look at like what Enbridge paid to be able to build the pipeline, and for people's water up north, for native people's water, like they did not pay enough.
Wow. So let me ask you, what advice would you give people that are interested in the environment and are listening and saying, hey, I agree with what Tracy here is saying, and I think I'd like to do that in my city or my community?
I'll preface this by saying I don't think that we know everything. We're definitely still learning every day. But some of the things that I can say we've learned is that you got to pick some local issues or find some things that really have local targets, something that you can people can feel invested in where they're at, like in their city, in their neighborhood. We aren't located in East Phillips, but all of us are located in the Twin Cities, so we can play a support role in that, for example. Some of the other lessons that we've learned is, supporting other people's movements and other activities and making connections. So when there's major uprisings around police brutality, we're making the connections to environmental racism and why it's important. For all of the pro-abortion rallies that happened, we were there and speaking about the connections. Like, why are the same people taking
Sounds
away...
like you learned from Mr. Bellecourt.
Right? Yeah, why are the same people who want to take away my right to choose are the same people who are fighting against environmental regulations and fighting and keeping Line 3 flowing. So making these connections has been really important, both to grow our group, but also to set us apart from all the rest of the environmental movement. Like, nobody else is out at Pride and out at the police brutality rallies. And so I think that makes us really unique, but also how we focus on larger issues, not just like individual choice stuff.
So if people want to learn more about how you're doing things, your social media, Facebook, Instagram, how would they get a hold of the Climate Justice Committee?
We are at Climate Justice MN on Facebook and Instagram are our primary ones. We do have a website, climatejusticemn.net.
That concludes our time. This went quickly, but I enjoyed it so much. Thank you for being with Fight Back Radio, Tracy.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Tracy Molm, true fighter for climate justice. We'll post in the show notes an article that fightbacknews.org did about the Minnesota Climate Justice Committee recently that called attention to the many spills from these different pipelines that have been going on. It was the anniversary of one in Kalamazoo that was major, and they went to a farmer's market and protested about it. So you should read about that. And you can follow in Fight Back News climate justice issues, labor, national liberation, international issues. It's a place to go for news and views from the people's struggle. Fightbacknews.org. Also, we're going to put in the show notes the petition that Tracy talked about to get the Army Corps of Engineers to do the environmental impact study that's required by law for Line 3. And we want Fight Back radio listeners to walk the walk. We don't want to just be armchair Marxists or socialists or activists or whatever we are. So click on in the show notes on the petition and sign it to show that we show support for what Tracy's trying to do with the Climate Justice Committee and get the Army Corps of Engineers to do what they should be doing by law anyways. If you want to reach me or you want to reach Fight Back Radio, you can get us at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. That's richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And, be sure to, tell a friend, write a review, give us 5 stars, tweet about it, social media. All those things really, really help. They make a difference. And for those of you that have done that, I thank you for that. Also, I want to give a big thank you again to our guest today, Tracy Molm. And finally, to our production team, Vince Olson, Shane Tremley. They make it all happen. And so thank you guys. So finally, for the entire Fight Back Radio team, I'm Richard Berg saying until next time, all power to the people.